Hi guys, welcome back to the third of our attack detection fundamentals workshops. It's just me today going through discovery and lateral movement. We've got a ton of stuff to go through, so we're going to get started. So, as I say, just me, Alfie Champion. I look after all things purple, F-Secure Consulting. And we should be familiar by now with the structure of these workshops. So essentially, we're going to be doing the standard offensing forms defense. We're going to be carrying out some attack techniques and looking at ways in which we can detect them, and then ultimately ways in which we can prevent them. Our understanding of this and kind of what we're trying to do here is show, as it rightly says there, the fundamentals behind what we think enterprise products are doing. And obviously there's far more complexity with regards to external kind of threat feeds and data analysis and correlation, etc. But we think ultimately the things that we're going to show in these workshops are going to provide you with the things that underpin those products. Similarly, what we're talking about here is not going to be an exhaustive look at every attacker technique. We're not going to talk too much about the pros and the cons of the various kind of detection logic that we talk about. I would recommend, as I've done before, the blogs from Jared Atkinson in relation to capability abstraction and the funded fidelity, if you're looking for something along those lines. And if we move on then, so exactly the same, we're going to analyze, we're going to emulate, and we're going to observe. We're going to take some attacker TTPs, we're going to try them out in our controlled lab environment, and then we're going to observe the traces they leave. What opportunities do we have as defenders to detect those things? So slightly different in terms of the lab setup this time round. So things are a little bit more complicated. Of course, because we were talking about discovery and lateral movement here, I need some network assets to discover, and I need some assets to move to laterally to make this worthwhile. So I've got a slightly more complicated lab, just a simple Active Directory environment set up there. You can see my workstation, my domain controller. And this time I'm feeding my logs into an Elastic stack. I'm using Roberto Rodriguez's Helk stack. There's links, ton of links, in fact, at the bottom of this slide, and there's several more in the blogs that are now live. So if you're looking to set up your own test environment, either Roberto's Mordor labs are some environments you can use there. Similarly, there's the detection lab link there as well. But let's get started then. So where are we? Well, we're in that discovery and lateral movement phase now. So as we've done before, just a brief introduction in terms of what we're looking to achieve from an offensive perspective at this point. So discovery, when we land in a network, we need to perform some kind of situational awareness activity. So we're looking at everything from local host enumeration, understanding the configuration of the actual machine that we've landed on, as well as the wider network. So that could be things like port scans, that could be things like network share discovery, which is something obviously we're going to touch on in a moment. And then from a lateral movement perspective, unless you're very, very lucky or very skilled as an attacker, the likelihood is that even the most sophisticated spear phishing campaign isn't going to land you on the host that you need to be on with the right privileges to achieve what your objective might be. Of course, there are exceptions, so things like ransomware that's just targeted at an individual opening an email, for instance. That's kind of pretty cut and dry, but when we're looking at more targeted attacks that are looking to pivot through the network in some way, kind of gaining additional privileges and gaining additional kind of network visibility of target systems, we're going to have to move from host to host. So we're going to cover some of the techniques that we can use to do that. And this includes both some additional tooling, but also some common administrative tools. So things like PSExec, which you might be familiar with. From a detection standpoint, we're covering a lot of the things that we've done before. We're at least using the same log sources. So our networking events are things like just kind of network monitoring, but also sys1 event ID 3, which is our network connection, new network connection. We're going to be looking at endpoint logs again. That includes both event logs and logs augmented by sysmon. And then we're also going to be touching a bit more actually this week on some of the EDR capabilities. So one of the in particular things there to call out is the use of ETW. And this is something that we haven't really touched on before. So I'm just going to a brief introduction. ETW is event tracing for Windows. And I've stolen this description straight off the Microsoft website. An efficient kernel level tracing facility that lets you log kernel and application defined events to a log file. And this can include everything from network events, system health. And if you look on the right hand side, this is the tool that we're going to be using extensively throughout the lab guides. and this is Silk ETW, and this is made by Ruben Boonen, as you can see there. And there's also a service variant called Silk Service as well, which we're going to be using. Now, basically the way this works, without going too much into the weeds of ETW, is essentially you register consumers, and these consumers can, as you might guess, consume log events from providers. And you can see in just the help there from Silk ETW, you can see an example of some of those, including the .NET runtime provider, the DNS client, and the LDAP client. And there are hundreds more. There's actually a link in the blog to several examples of those that you can use in your own learning. In terms of labs this week, we've got tons of them, and we've got both the discovery elements in terms of doing some reconnaissance on high privileged groups and users. We're going to be enumerating some network shares with a tool called Sharp Shares. We're going to be doing what I think is quite a fun exercise of pivoting through a file share that we discover using the C3 framework. We're then going to move into our lateral movement exercises and use PSExec and also WMI for those. We've got some extensions to some of those labs, both in the lab guides, but also as I go through these slides. So tons of stuff to go through. So let's get started then on our first lab, group enumeration. So again, when you land in a corporate network, the likelihood is you're going to need to understand, who the high privilege users are, where those assets are that you're going to be targeting, ways that you can increase your privilege within an environment to then carry out your objective. There's a link there at the bottom to Microsoft, to a article that explains all of the privileged groups within Active Directory, and that includes everything from domain admins and enterprise admins, but goes further into groups like backup operators that can have additional very high privileges within your AD environment. But this can also extend from your standard high privileged AD users to users that have a particular trait. And one of those that we're going to focus on today is going to be those that are roastable. And the two things we're going to cover off here are curb roastable users and AS rep roastable users. Now, I'm not going to go into the specifics of what makes a curb roastable user or what makes an AS rep roastable user. There's some really great Harnjoy posts on those, and again, they're linked in the lab guides. But basically, what we're looking at here is, firstly, for curb roasting users, this is basically any user that has a service principal name entry, and these are commonly known as service accounts. So we're going to be targeting some of those in our lab. And secondly, AS rep roasting is a little bit more complicated, but essentially this is where the users have a particular property where they don't require pre-authentication. I won't get into specifics of that, but let's get started and see what we can find. It's worth mentioning, I'm actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the enumeration of the domain admin groups, etc. But all of the content is in the lab guides, and for the purposes of this lab, you can use exactly the learnings from my demonstration here to do it with other groups as well. So you can carry that out in your own time. So demo. So what you can see here is something that you're probably very familiar with by now, and this is our Covenant dashboard. So just as before, we're going to use this. We're going to create a listener. As you can see, I already have one there, just a HTTP listener. I'm going to take a grunt that I've actually already made, and I'm going to get an initial foothold. So I'm not going to do any of the stuff that Ricardo and I did in the first workshop in terms of delivery. We're just going to copy and paste it in here. I'm going to run that, and I'm going to return to my dashboard. And if all goes well, as you might expect from a video, I should see my grunt come back, and there we go. So if I refresh that and then go into the interact window there, you can see the first thing I'm going to do. In fact, the first thing I'm going to do is set the delay time so I get a slightly more responsive command line. And then I'm going to use Rubius. Now, Rubius is a tool from Harnjoy and a number of other contributors that can do all manner of Active Directory and Kerberos interaction and exploitation here. So you can see I've just paused it there, just a list of commands that are integrated into Rubius, and Rubius itself is integrated into Covenant. And you can see two there that are obviously going to be useful to us, the Kerber roasting and the AS rep roasting. So let's get started on the first of those, the Kerber roast. So worth mentioning as well that my environment here is obviously very simple. So I've actually had to go out and create a service account with an SPN to do this. But if I just scroll up here, you can see what's happened here is the most notable thing, in fact, for what we're going to dig into at the moment, is we're searching the current domain for curb roastable users. So we'll get into the weeds of what that looks like on the network. And then we found one user that fits that profile conveniently, and that's our SQL user. And you'll often find if you carry this out in either in offensive engagements or as a defender, that it's typically things like SQL or MS SQL service accounts that you often find as service accounts. And as you'll see from this attack, it's imperative that those passwords are of a reasonable length so that they can resist a brute force attack, which is exactly what you would do with this hash that you can see here. So I've done that. You can see my SQL account. There's the hash. And you could use something like hashcat, for example, to take that hash and try and crack it offline on a suitably high-powered machine. And then our second command, nice and simple, just running the default command here, Rubius, but with an AS rep roast. And again, I've obviously configured a user within our account, within our lab environment to do this. And in this case, actually, quite alarmingly, it's our domain administrator, the administrator account there. And as you'll see, there's a very similar profile here. There's a hash file there. I can take that and I can put it into the likes of hashcat to obtain, hopefully, if the password is sufficiently weak, a plain text password. So I'm not going to dig too much into how you detect this in terms of the actual act of requesting the relevant ticket information. What I'm going to focus on here is the discovery piece of this. So how do I, as an attacker, or how do my tools, more importantly, I guess, go out and discover either Kerber roastable or AS rep roastable users? Well, the first thing we can do is make use of a source that we haven't touched on before, and this is the first of our ETW providers, and this is our LDAP client. So there's a configuration snippet that you can use within the lab guides that are live, but essentially we can look for event ID 30, which is just a local LDAP query, and we can tie that back to the processes that actually made those queries. So here, obviously, it's not the most OPSEC. You can see that our process name in the first place is Grunt Stager. But if we take a look at the search filter field here, what we can do is actually, if we go back to the Rubius code base here, on the top two lines there, I've kind of cut this out a little bit just for readability, but you can see some obvious filters being used here. So obviously some are slightly less obvious, but I'll just go through them. So the first one, as we look here, that SAM account type. That just says that I only want to receive back Active Directory users. So I'm not asking for computers or group objects. I just want users that are obviously Kerber roastable. I can then see mentioned, and then we've got the SAM account name. So I don't want to get the KRB TGT back there. I won't go into specifics of why that is, but that's not a useful one for us right now. And then finally, that user account control field there. And all that's saying is I don't want any users that are disabled. Of course, if I go and get a hash that I can crack and I do that, and then I'm using an account that's disabled, that's going to be no use to me. So I only want enabled users that have an SPN. If I move on, I can do exactly the same thing, same process here, analyzing the Rubius code base using an AS rep row. So if I just look at this filter, again, we can see that SAM account type is a user, but this time there's no service principal name, there's just this user account control. Now, what this means is that we do not have the the pre-authentication is not required. You can look this up if there's a link at the bottom there, but I just take a snippet from the Microsoft website. You can see there's our evidence in our ETW provider log there, and just a snippet from the TechNet article from Microsoft. You can see that all users with do not require Kerberos pre-authentication enabled are going to be returned by that very specific user account control. And in fact, you can do this in the labs yourself. But if you use just AD users or computers, you can do a custom search here. So I just in the advanced column, I can just copy and paste the query that I saw in my logs straight into this box and find. You can see, as we saw from the Covenant output, that only one user, the administrator user, comes back. And right there, we can see that the do not require Kerberos authentication option has been ticked. So that's just an example of two user discovery techniques that we can use, and we can just use our LDAP filters given to us from the ETW provider, and that they could themselves be suspect. Moving on then to lab number 2, share enumeration. So in a typical corporate environment, you're going to have lots of file shares, both just as a way to share information in a legitimate way, but you'll also commonly find file shares on or kind of drives from other hosts that aren't intended to be shared, and they can often have all manner of sensitive information in them, from configuration files to just passwords stored in plain text in your kind of typical just text file or something. We're going to be using a tool called Sharp Shares, and this is a tool from Dwight Hohenstein. And in his own words, he says this is the quick and dirty share enumeration tool. But the applicability for this lab is it's a nice and simple bit of code, and we can apply just the same kind of code-based analysis to Sharp Shares as we did to Rubius just before this. So we're going to be doing that, and then shortly after that, we're also going to be looking at a very specific file share, which is the group policy preference files that are stored in sys files. So we'll come on to that in a second, but firstly, let's have a look at Sharp Shares. So before we get started here, you can see I'm back on one of my workstations. Here I've already compiled the Sharp Shares executable. It's on my desktop, and I'm just going to run it from a PowerShell window. So if I just do that now, all I can do is just type the Sharp Shares executable name and give it an argument of shares and let that run. And you can see there, nice and simple, it's enumerated the computer objects within the environment, and it's told me all of the shares that are both unreadable, importantly for later, but also that I can list. And I guess most importantly for the next lab, you'll notice there's a C3 share there that's been exposed on our domain controller. So on the face of it, a very simple tool. It doesn't appear to be doing too much, but if we dig into the weeds of this and understand what's going on under the hood, well, the first thing we're going to see is the way in which Sharp Shares goes out to find these file shares is it has to actively go and make a network connection with each of the computer objects that it finds, and ask them essentially what shares are being hosted there. So I can't really demonstrate this too well with a scale of my lab because I don't have a whole corporate network's worth of file shares, but you can look in just the same way as we've done before for our sys1 event ID 3s there. And then we can cover another event ID that we haven't covered before. So this is for object access logging. So this is an enhanced auditing feature, and you can do this for both where file share access is a success or where it's a failure. And we have two event IDs of interest here. So we have a 5140 and a 5145. 5140 is the initial network share being accessed, and then a 5145 is an object within that share being accessed. So if we take a look at all these logs being shipped back to our Elastic Stack, it's worth mentioning here that I do cover how to enable this setting in the lab as well. But the first thing, we can just pick out a few of these, and we can see, for instance, that here's an event log 5140. Our test user has attempted to access the admin share. So this is an alias for the Windows directory, as you can see there, from our share name and our share path. And that was an audit failure. As a standard user, we have no business being in the Windows directory of a domain controller, and we get an audit failure there. Similarly, as you move down, we can see that the C3 share, so this is just hosted in the root of the C directory, C3, as you can see, and that is an audit success. So as you'll see, I've configured this share so that anyone can have access, but we do see a success there. And a potential detection opportunity here is just the number. If you imagine this is scaled up to an entire corporate environment, the number of audit failures that you're going to see from our test user is potentially going to be something of note. And similarly, if you look in the column before then as well, the admin shares, basically enumerating all of these different shares, that could also be worthy of investigation. We turn back to our LDAP client ETW provider. The way, as I said, that the way in which Sharp Shares works is it goes and finds out all of the computer objects within the environment to then talk to them individually. So if we actually take a little look at this, the first thing it does is get the domain and get the domain controllers. So actually the way it does this is through a standard .NET namespace. So what you're seeing here is is not the most obvious of LDAP queries, but just the same way we can actually cheat a little bit and take that query, stick it into our custom search as before, and see what that gets us back. And we can see, just as expected, we get 2 domain controllers, as you can see from the bottom left of the search results. And we can actually see the code snippet from this taken from Sharp Shares there. So it's using that get current domain function to return a domain object, and then it's enumerating the domain controllers from there. So whilst this is obviously interesting, the likelihood is that many other tools within and services within your environment are going to be doing a similar thing, just using the standard Microsoft tools for this, and therefore that's probably not enough. They're going to get a lot of false positives if we just look for this alone. But it carries out a second LDAP filter as well. So if we look at a bit more of this, we can see in the get computers function, it's doing exactly the same as we've done before with these kind of LDAP filter construction. And you can see what it's doing is looking for all objects that are computer objects. And then from there, something that we haven't really touched on yet, is it's specifying now which properties of those objects we actually want to get back. So essentially what it's doing is saying, I'm looking for all computers, and all I care about is the name of them, because all I need to contact them on the network is to get that name, and then I can resolve that and talk to them. And the last thing is the network monitoring. So as I mentioned, there's the event ID 3, but also if you use something like Wireshark, and you just have this running whilst you record your activity with Sharp Shares, you'll see this, firstly, the netshare enum all request there. And this is the result of the netshare enum function from the Net API 32 DLL that's being used here. So essentially, it's just talking to the target host and saying, give me back all of the network shares that you have. And then from there, I've actually got code snippet over there. There you go, the enum net shares there. And if I go further on in this packet capture, you can see that one by one, my user is going through and saying, let's try and connect to the admin share. Let's try and connect to the C drive. Let's try and connect to sysfile. And then finally with sysfile, it gets a success. So we have a few different opportunities here. And in fact, if you've got an IDS in place, you could use like a snort alert or a bro or Zeek or something. And it could be that you can create some kind of effective alert on this as well. Moving on slightly, so a different application of the same log source. So we can use our 5145s, in fact, to identify attackers targeting group policy preference files. Now, at a high level, group policy preference files allow administrators in a legitimate way to customize the hosts or the domain joined hosts within their environment. So this could be everything from creating local users, setting scheduled tasks, and most critically, as we'll find, changing local administrator passwords. And for that last thing, the way that it does that, or it did do that, up until you see this notification from Microsoft here, is it would store those passwords in a C password field, you can see here, buried within the policies within sysfile. So there's a number of different tools that you can use to hunt for these, but at the most basic level, we could just use the fine string executable that's on Windows machines by default. And you can see there, basically what I'm doing is a case insensitive search for the word C password buried within any of the policies in sysfile. Now, the reason that this is still relevant, 6 years on, is because when this patch was applied, it didn't actually purge our policy files of the C password entries. It just stopped us as administrators from making new ones. So if an administrator didn't realize that, those passwords could be buried within these forgotten files, and we could pull those out and decrypt them with an encryption key that's since been made public. And then if our corporate environment isn't using something like LAPS or a local administrator password solution, then there's a chance that we could move laterally within an environment at will based on a shared local admin password. So whilst this might not be a problem in your estate, it's definitely worth considering whether or not you have the ability to detect someone looking for this. So I just got a screenshot of a tweet here from Samir, who talks about ways that we can apply our event ID 5145 to some threat hunting. And for the purposes of this lab, one of the really useful ones is this. So what he's saying here is this is a way for us to detect when suspicious users are accessing files that they have no right to be doing. So if we just read through this, essentially what we're saying is, show me all of the Active Directory users that are not machine accounts, if I just start from the bottom there. So a machine account is signified by the dollar at the end. So he's saying, show me all of the accounts that are user objects that are accessing policies that are destined for machines. So you can see in the middle of that our relative target name. So the file object contains the machines, and this is all, of course, in the share name of sysvol. So if I just skip on back into my Elastic Stack, you can see here a great example where my administrator username there is accessing a machine policy in sysvol, and it has no right to be doing that in a standard context. So it's just an example here of a detection that you could build to put your 5145s to work if you're looking for someone accessing or attempting to find group policy preference files. Some considerations before you go out and implement these. It's worth mentioning that everything that I've been speaking about with regards to, particularly with regards to share enumeration, is completely customizable in terms of the tools that we're using. The same actually goes for Rubius as well. Whilst we had a very simple example just using the default, you can do all manner of customizations with that, including restricting it to the encryption type on the tickets, to targeting a very specific user, or setting time frames for when those tickets or when those passwords were set, all kinds of things to make our activity slightly more discreet potentially. And it's worth kind of looking at the customization options within Rubius there and seeing whether or not you can detect those. But then on our file shares, there's an opportunity to slow down that enumeration activity. So that the term we use is low and slow. So if I, rather than kind of hammering all of these file shares in a quick time frame, if I do this far slower over the course of several days or a week, it might be that the threshold that's been set in an alert is not sufficiently low enough to find that activity. So it's worth mentioning that. It's also worth mentioning scanning services as well. If you've got some kind of security tooling in place that's going to be actively trying to carry out scanning of the wider network and looking for be that vulnerabilities or exposed file shares or anything like that, it might be that they impact on the false positive ratio that you're getting with those alerts. And the sheer volume of telemetry as well. So one of the things that ETW is notorious for is just the volume of traffic that you create. Even just in the labs that we're doing here with a couple of ETW providers, if you look in Event Viewer or in the event log as we've done in the previous lab, so Ricardo and I did in the first lab, you'll see that there's just the volume of alerts there, or the volume of raw telemetry is quite large. And if you scale that up, it might be that the ratio of kind of alerts to noise, as it were, is quite significant. So it's worth mentioning those and worth looking at those in your own stacks as well. So onto our third lab, something a little bit different here. So what we're going to be looking at is pivoting our traffic through a file share, essentially. So we saw in the previous example with sharp shares that we have this listable share, the C3 file share that's been exposed on our domain controller. And as I set it up, you can see in this screenshot that everyone has the ability to read and to write to this share. Now, the reason this is worthy of note is because we'll often find in a corporate environment where there's some degree of network segregation going on, that you can't, as an attacker with your compromised host, talk directly to another host that it might be that you want to compromise. So what might also be the case is there are shared resources within the environment that actually both of those workstations can access. And this doesn't just go for file shares, it could go for shared services as well. So any other kind of information sharing thing that might be there. But what we can do though is if we as an attacker can write to that file share and our target host can read from it, it might be that we have an opportunity here for basically doing that in two directions. We write, they read, they write, we read, and we can obtain some degree of persistence on the other side of that segregation. So I've got a demo here of using C3, so I'll get started with that. So first thing to note, here's our file share exposed again. So it's worth mentioning for the, I guess, simplicity in this lab, what I've done is I've accessed this file share from my attacker host. So obviously in a real scenario here, an attacker would have obtained a foothold through some other means, and now they'd be pivoting further into the network. But actually for us, I've got our attacker machine is talking to the file share directly, and then our workstations we've used previously is then talking to that same file share. So you can see I've got C3 open on the right hand side, a Covenant back open on the left. First thing I'm going to do is create a negotiation channel using a file share. So I won't get into the specifics of what a negotiation channel as opposed to a non-negotiation channel means. There's a blog that accompanied C3 that you can see for the specifics on what those mean. But what you can see here essentially is that I've given the UNC file path for our share. It's worth mentioning here as well that because my attacker machine isn't on the corporate network, the same as my workstation, it can't resolve the DC2 host name, but in a normal environment you could use just DC2 there just to make things quicker. But for me, I have to put the IP address in. And I've created a testing folder, if you saw that. So as you can see there, our gateway, our C3 gateway, is now talking to that file share. It's created a new folder called testing, and it can now write messages into that. From there, I'm going to do something that I think is probably the coolest part of this, is I'm going to establish a connector here using our Covenant server. So in this case, I've got Covenant and C3 next to each other on the same host, but they could be separate in your attacking infrastructure. But essentially, what's happening here is C3 has created a bridge. If I just refresh the dashboard here, so you can see that's come in. I refresh the dashboard, and now I've got a C3 bridge here. So I've got a new listener type added to Covenant. So we'll see the importance of that in just a sec. But now if I go and click my UNC file share channel, I could just request a new relay from C3. So this is just a simple thing here. We're going to be using the defaults. So I'm just giving it an arbitrary name, just UNC. I'm going to be using a 64-bit executable. Just as with the other examples, I'm just going to copy and paste this executable onto our target workstation. I'm not going to deliver it in any other more discrete means because we don't need to for the purposes of this. But our relay has been pre-configured with all of the settings to talk to that file share. So if I take that relay and I copy and paste it onto my workstation, so I just changed the remote desktop there. You can see I've done this already, and I just run that from this workstation. What's going to happen here is that relay is going to launch in the context of our domain user, so our test.user again. And then from there, you can see there we've got our foothold there. So that UNC, that green icon is for our relay. So what's happening here now is that our relay is talking to the exposed C3 file share. It's writing messages into that file share. And then the gateway is on the other side of that, is reading those messages and responding to them. So we essentially have a two-way communication, just as we would have done if we were using our HTTP listener, as we did in previous examples. And so now it's worth mentioning that C3 just focuses on, as the name suggests, just on the command and control element. So the way that we actually get some post-exploitation out of this is to add a peripheral. So because I integrated just at the start of this, I integrated with Covenant, I can request a grunt to be added into that relay. So one thing we touched on in the first workshop with Ricardo was the use of Sharpshooter to do essentially to inject shellcode directly into our running process. So in that case, we saw that we were using Excel, and there was no child processes spawned off the back of that. And in this case, at the time of recording this anyway, that's exactly what our relay is doing. It's using a create thread to create an instance of our grunt within the running process. And if we let that run, there we go. We can see just as before, our grunt comes back into our Covenant dashboard, but this time it's not a HTTP listener. It's going through the bridge that we established before. And if I run an arbitrary command in this window, you can see that we do have a foothold on that target machine with all of our traffic being pivoted through our file share, which I think is pretty cool. There we go. So what can we do to detect that? Well, the first thing is we can use our 5145s again. And in fact, there's a few different things we can do with those. So the first thing to note here is within that testing directory that we created, there's these randomly named files. And most importantly, there's these .lock files as well. And if we look at the code base for this channel in C3, we can see this is the line where within the on-center channel function, we're creating this file name that ends in .lock. And basically, obviously, we can see that there. But what this bit of code is doing, without having to go into the nitty-gritty of it, basically, we don't want our relay to be reading the files from this file share before we finish writing the data to them, because obviously that's going to end up with issues with our communication as we're trying to send messages that are getting consumed before they're actually complete. So the way that we deal with this in this channel is to create a lock file. As you can see in this little segment here, create file, lock file path. We then write our contents to that file, and then we're all done with that. We're going to remove the lock file. And when our relay lists this directory, it will see the files that don't have that lock file anymore and say, okay, these files are ready to be consumed. The messages there are all written and done, and now I can consume them. So another thing we can use with our 5145s is to take note of the access masks that are assigned in the log entries. So without getting into the weeds here, basically what we can do is, as a user, when we request access to a file in the file share, we basically specify what it is and the way in which we're going to be accessing that. So the two that are of note here are the hex entry of 2, which is to write data, and then that second one there, so the 1000081, which amongst other things includes the ability to read data and to list the directory. So you can probably already see there's our read and there's our write, and that's exactly what we need to achieve this command and control channel. So what you're seeing here is I've filtered for only the read events. So I can see it just for clarity, the source IP address in the far right is the .100 address is our attacker machine. So what we can see here is that our attacker machine, or our gateway in this instance, is polling every 10 seconds against our file share with the same mask, the same directory, and under the hood, this is just listing that directory to see if there are any messages there that should be actioned. So of course, when I start to send my covenant messages back and forth, and I'm starting to do some more post exploitation, that's when it's going to need to see those files and consume them. But for now, nothing is actually happening here. It's just polling again and again every 10 seconds. So one, there's that beaconing behavior that could be of note. So moving on then, how do we go about this with regards to the write? How can I see? So obviously my grunt was requested from C3, was staged through that file share, and then ultimately injected into my relay. So can I look for the write events in the same way? Well, yes, you can. As you can see there, we're using that hex value of 2, which is our write event. And then you'll have to trust me or do it in your own lab. But when you request that grunt, that spike, as you'll see there, those write events are us writing the grunt payload to the file share that are then consumed on the other side by our relay. Now, the immediate thing to discount here is, due to the way in which C3 works, it's going to encrypt all of the traffic, and it's going to chunk that data up as well, so that you're never going to end up with just a grunt payload sat on a file share on disk. So we can't rely on, for instance, our AV or anything else there to detect that payload as being something malicious. But one tactic that we can use is to leverage the fact that the grunt is written with .NET. So what we can do is look for anomalous CLR loading. So this is quite a complicated topic, and we're not going to go too deep into this. But essentially, where our grunt is written in .NET, when you compile .NET, you end up with an assembly file, and that file is written in Common Intermediate Language, or CIL. And the way in which we execute those assemblies is we need something to interpret those, and that thing is the CLR, the Common Language Runtime. So you can see on the left-hand side here, I'm using a tool called PSExec. Again, open source, you can grab that. You can look at the code for it even, and we're going to use it in the lab environments as well. But we can see within our relay, when you load the grunt, the CLR is launched, and there's some interesting things you'll note here in terms of those random assembly names, but we won't cover that too much here. But suffice to say that if you run this with just the relay and look at the PSExec window, you'll see that there are no tabs even for .NET. And once you inject your grunt, you'll see those appear. So that's exactly what's happening. That's the CLR being loaded into our relay process. Now, looking for that action alone is not going to be a fruitful exercise, because as you see on the right hand side, I've just opened a completely fresh PowerShell process and done the same thing, looking in PSExec at the .NET assemblies, and just as we see, the CLR has been loaded into PowerShell as part of its standard operating procedure. So we can't focus on that alone. But what we can do is focus on those anomalies. So as an attacker, if I'm just looking at some of the previous things we've done here, if I'm looking to pivot, say, my share enumeration, or I'm looking to hide my file share traffic going between our exposed share and our gateway, I might be using something like Explorer, for instance, to hide that, so that if someone saw the process list in there, they'd say, oh, okay, it's just our Explorer process is accessing file shares. And aside from a user being nosy or something, it might be that that's not worthy of investigation, potentially. Likewise, if we've got some internet-bound traffic, so we've got like our HTTP channels we've used previously with Covenant, if that's coming from, let's say, a browser, it might be that we're like, okay, they're browsing a given domain, that's probably not worthy of note either, potentially. Well, what we could do is look for cases where, very specifically to malicious.net, is if the CLR has been loaded into those processes, and you could do this yourself if you're Open Process Hacker on any of those processes, including Explorer and some of the browsers, that they won't have the CLR loaded in normal operation. And it could be that if you start seeing CLR being loaded, that's a sign that someone is doing something potentially anomalous within those processes. And a way that we can get access to this telemetry within our logging is through another source here. So what I'm using is a Windows kernel trace here. So again, the configurations for Silk ETW as we're using are going to be in the lab guides. But one thing to note here is right there. You can see that the CLR DLL, which is essentially the main DLL for the CLR in .NET 4 and onwards, that is being loaded into our relay process. So you could apply this to hunts for other processes that otherwise have no reason to be doing this. A good example of the applications of this is using or hunting for Cobalt Strike. So one thing that's very popular at the moment is the use of the execute assembly function within Cobalt Strike. So essentially we can launch .NET assemblies from within our beacon. And the way that works is to spawn a sacrificial process and then inject into that. And that process is going to launch the CLR, and then by virtue of that is then going to run our .NET assemblies. So if the attacker is not kind of adhering to or not using a process there that's likely to launch the CLR normally, it might be that you have an opportunity there to spot them there if they're using a process that otherwise would not be doing so. So there are other bits of kind of .NET inspection we can be doing here, and it's worth mentioning as well, there's a ton of defense evasion stuff that's come out recently. There's some great blogs from Adam Chester and Dom Chell at PSExec that you can look at, but just for now, this is one opportunity that we might have to detect this stuff going on. So moving on more squarely into our lateral movement exercises then. So PSExec, and this is the tool that probably many people will be familiar with, and it's used by a whole host of admins, and more worse than that, it's used by a whole host of threat actors as well, the likes of Oil Rig, Cobalt Group, Carbonac. And what it allows us to do, so it's a Windows System Internals tool. You can download it from the link at the bottom, and we can run this on our source machine and then communicate with other hosts. And there's integrations with PSExec or things that follow the same workflow, at least, as PSExec in attacker frameworks like Cobalt Strike and Metasploit as well. So under the hood, what this is doing, the first thing it's going to do when we run our PSExec process is connect to the admin share of our target machine. And we talked about that briefly before, this alias for C Windows. It's then going to upload a service executable with a name, or at least in the default context, is with a name of PSExec service. And it's then going to create a new service on our target machine that's going to launch that executable. And then from there, we can then use that service. So let's take a look at it in action now. So I'm back on my workstation again. As you'll see here, the first thing I'm going to do in this case is run a run as command. So you might be familiar with this. So basically, I'm going to create a new command prompt in the context of another user. And in this case, it's going to be our domain admin user. So from here, I'm going to change directory and go into my sysinternals folder that I've downloaded. And I'm then going to start writing out my PSExec command. So the first thing I'm going to do, as we'll see usefully later, is accept the license agreement there so it doesn't pop up with a message. And I'm then going to connect to the DC2 and run a command prompt window. And you can see semi-interactive shell spawns up here, super easy to use from an administrative point of view. And we can just run commands as if we're on that host. So nice and easy. So whilst it's obviously nice and simple to the end user, we've already seen that there's a ton of stuff that's going on under the hood there. So let's first focus on the source. So on the machine that we're launching PSExec on. Well, the first thing we're going to see are events like these. So the first one, we can use this one for the registry change. So if I use that accept EULA flag, or I accept the EULA when it pops up, I'm going to add this registry key onto my machine. Now, once you've accepted that, that key is going to stay there. So it's not going to give you a point in time detection potentially. But what you can do is hunt for this across your environment. And if you're in such an environment that you don't use PSExec, it might be that finding this key is going to give you a sign that someone has been using PSExec. The next one to note is the event ID 1 for Sysmon or our 4688 for process creation. And that's simply going to be the PSExec process, which is obviously relatively self-explanatory. And lastly, as we've seen before, we're going to get a network connection from our workstation host to the domain controller that we're targeting here. One other thing to mention, which potentially, depending on your environment, could be a bit of an incriminating event in itself, is that escalation from our standard test.user to administrator. And that's going to be a 4648, which is the use of explicit credentials to change our user. So if you've got a good track of where users or who your domain administrators are and where they're authenticating from, this very act of elevating our privilege could be worthy of an alert. But now it's worth noting that if I compromise a workstation, I don't necessarily have to put PSExec on the disk to run it and then use it there. What I could do is proxy some traffic through that host. And similarly, if I plug my attacker machine into the corporate network, by breaking in or something, we might not have telemetry on that device to pull some of these things off. So let's focus now on the target host. So a few things here then. So the first is going to be that creation of the PSExec service within our admin share. So that's a file creation event, Sysmon event ID 11. We then have a couple of options for the service creation, so one of which is the 7045. So we're going to see, in the default way, we're going to see PSExec service being installed, and then it's going to enter a running state with an event ID 7036. And then something we'll touch on in the labs as well is the way in which we maintain a semi-interactive shell is by using named pipes there. And you can see that you're going to get 5145 events, just as we've seen in several different examples within this workshop. A pipe for the standard input, the standard error, and the standard output. So if you're an elite attacker or potentially an admin that wants to get away with using PSExec, you might change the name of the executable to try and get past maybe that event ID 1. But if you look on the right hand side, the metadata that's captured in that event, you can see that though we've changed the name of the image there, so our harmless admin tool.exe is now running, we can do a simple evaluation here where the file name doesn't match the original file name, or further, there's some metadata there with regards to the description and the product and the company that we could use to identify, potentially even just a suspicious admin that's trying to evade detection using PSExec. And then the other thing to consider is where PSExec is implemented in some ways within some other attacker frameworks. I mentioned one of those here, which is Metasploit. So if we just look here at the configuration options for the PSExec module, immediately you can see some things that are potentially useful to us as attackers and things to consider as defenders. So we can change the description and the name of the display name and the name of the image file that we use on that target system. So if we're looking specifically for that PSExec service executable, we could change the name here to evade that potentially. And likewise, if we're looking for file creation events within the admin share, we could change that share here to evade that. So it's worth considering that there are some customization options both in PSExec, in Metasploit, but in other frameworks as well that's worth considering. And then specifically when it comes to Metasploit, what we can do is use that PSExec module we just looked at to essentially launch a Meterpreter payload. So that's the implant that we've seen before into memory. And one way of doing that, as you can see here, is with a PowerShell one-liner that becomes our image file. So we can see our 7045, so that's our new service creation event. But this time, rather than our simple executable, we've got this long string that includes our PowerShell command to launch that payload. And what this opens up for us if we're using, say, script block logging here, is some 4104 events. So we can see straight away that we've got a script block there that is probably going to be of interest. We can see it's using a base64 encoded string. We can see it's using some compression there, and it's basically going to unpack that and launch it. So you can look in some Sigma rules for examples of detecting this, but that in itself, based on what's the traits that we're seeing there, could be worthy of suspicion. And our last lab for today then is WMI. So again, just like PSExec, it's been used by a whole host of threat actors, oil rig again, but also used in Olympic Destroyer, so the South Korean Olympic Games attack. And it's actually also used in a variant of the Astaroth malware that Anant's covered last time out. So WMI provides us with the ability to move between hosts, and we actually touched on this in the first workshop with Ricardo as ways to evade detection, and we'll see exactly how that works here. But for one, there is a standard executable that you can use on a Windows device, and that's the wimic command. But there's also implementations just like PSExec in a variety of other tools as well. And one example we're going to touch on here is the in-packet implementation, the WMI exec. So last demo for today, back onto our attacker machine this time, and we're just going to run WMI exec against our domain controller IP address, and we're going to use our administrator user. So I'll let that run. I'm going to type in the password for that user. And if all goes well, I'm going to connect directly to that host, and there straight away, just like with PSExec in terms of end user experience, I can start running commands on that device as if I was hands-on keyboard there. So nice and easy for the end user. So how do we detect this? Well, first thing is going to be that process creation event. So one is on the source side. As we mentioned, there's two sides to this. On the source side, we're going to see potentially the use of WMI or the wimic command. But if we're using, say, we're pivoting this traffic, or we're using the WMI exec command, we're going to see the creation of an event on the target host. If I just look at that here, sys1 event ID 1. So here I've just used the native wimic command. You can see I'm targeting the domain controller, and I can just run a create. And in this case, I'm just spawning a simple calc process. But that gives us back on the left-hand side, you can see the process ID, and on the right-hand side, you can see our calc process process ID 3912. And most critically for this is that bottom bit there, that parent image from the parent command line. So that WMI PRVSE executable with the flags of secured and embedding. So this we can use in our detection. So if I just move on a little bit, we can see how this all pieces together. So if I run that command and I run my who am I, as you can see in that top left, as we did in the demo, if I go and look at my event ID ones from my domain controller, you can see something very, very specific in terms of the process command line arguments. So there, my who am I becomes a command executable, a couple of flags, our who am I command embedded in there, and it's piping out, and this is critical, it's piping out its entries into the admin share of our local host. So, okay, what have we got then? So we've got that parent process, WMI PRVSE, and it's using the secured and embedding flags. It's spawning our command executable that's embedded the command in the middle of that, and by default, at least, it's writing to the local Windows directory into an arbitrarily named file, and then that, of course, is going to cause that access event to be generated both from our local host as it tries to write to that file, but also our source host, so that the host that's instigating this connection is going to read from that admin share to pull back the command line output, and that is how we achieve that semi-interactive shell that we saw from the video. So let's drill into that again. So we're back to our trusty 5140s and 5145s. So we're reading commands from the admin share. Now, if we apply the same kind of hunting methodology with our access masks, we can see a few access masks at play here. So the first one is that read data, we've got write data, and then critically, we also have a delete as well. So this translates to, quite simply, if we work upwards, our local host is going to write our command output. So you can see the 127001 is going to write to the admin share file. We can then see that our attacker host, or our .100, as we've seen before, is going to read the output of that command with our hex code 1 mask. And then when it's done consuming the command output, it's then going to delete that file. And you see, as we work through these logs, if you run a variety of different commands, you'll see that pattern emerge where our local host writes and then our remote host reads and deletes. And then lastly, we can look, just as we did previously, we can launch Wireshark, and we can look for some of the network artifacts that are produced in doing this. And one blog I would mention right here is Ricardo, who joined us for the first workshop. He's got a blog on specifically this subject, hunting for PSExec and other in-packet tools as well, which is well worth a read. But if we look here, I won't drill into this too much, but we can see here, you might recognize that structure there. So that's a GUID, as we mentioned before, with COM objects in the first workshop when we were looking at defense evasion. That's the same structure here. So we're using distributed COM or DCOM to communicate with our target host. And if we look at the bottom there, you can see in plain text here that our command parameters are being provided as part of the Win32 process startup object there. So we can see our who am I command. We can see that it's piping out to our local administrator share. And it's nice and easy to observe there. And you can do this in the lab guides as well. So just before we finish there, it's worth mentioning again that all of this tooling is configurable. So if I don't use the semi-interactive shell and I just specify a specific command, it might be that I'm not going to write to the admin share, or I could specify a different share to write to if I've got the access to it. So it's worth considering the limitations of those when you start trying to detect that kind of activity. But then a summary then. So we've covered, I hope you'll agree, a ton of stuff there from discovery and lateral movement. We've seen the parent-child process relationships, particularly useful for detecting that WMI lateral movement. We've seen with regards to things like our file share enumeration, we can see our established network connections. We've touched on a couple of ETW sources for looking at our suspicious LLAP queries, but also the anomalous loading of our CLR for the malicious.NET that we're using. And when we looked at our PSExec customization within Metasploit, we saw the use of some encoded PowerShell and the potential for detection there as well. And we also got the chance to use a few different lol bins as well. We used PSExec, so from the sysinternal suite, and we got a chance to play with our RC3 framework, and we got to use Covenant again. So there's a ton of stuff there. Just as before, this recording is going to be made available after this. And all of the lab guides should be up right now as well. So you can go through and replay this stuff. You can take this recording and wind it back and focus on the things that you find interesting as well. So next time, for the last in our series then, we've got the guys from the US. So Jordan and Derek are going to be talking about command and control and exfiltration. So we'll see a few different things there, some channels using HTTP, some DNS traffic as well. And also we'll be looking at a new channel that we'll be releasing next week as well, the Dropbox channel for C3 as well. So some great stuff to look at there. If you haven't already registered, there's a link at the bottom to register for that fourth and final workshop. But otherwise, thanks for listening.